Thanks for having me. And yeah, always great to be back with the Understand Energy crew. As Diana said, I did undergrad and master's at Stanford. So I took this class and TA'd for this class many years ago, back when solar cost about 10 times as much as it does now. And people were wondering how we were ever going to get to 25, 30% renewables, let alone thinking about a 100%. It would have been completely out of people's comprehension. But kind of what I want to talk about today is like, how can we decarbonize the electricity system and talk about the electricity system in general and the transitions that are happening within it. But the biggest trend by far, the biggest factor at play overall that's driving everything is decarbonization. That's driven by a number of factors, including policy, but also economics, customer choice, and other factors. So yeah, the place that I'm coming to this from is this basically what I do every day. I'm at E3. We're an energy consulting company, but specifically we focus on electricity. Specifically within electricity, we focus on the transition of the electricity system towards lower carbon resources. So how can we decarbonize the electricity system at low cost while maintaining reliability, safety, and equity? So we work all over the world, a lot in California and some international in the rest of the US. And we work for a really wide array of people within the electricity industry. So it could be utilities, it could be policymakers, it could be companies that develop wind and solar projects that are trying to sell those to utilities or sell them into competitive electricity markets. And we're a pretty technical consulting firm. So a lot of our projects involve modeling the grid. And so that's kind of what I'm going to be talking about today, is thinking about how can you use technical understanding of how the grid actually works to understand the impacts of different pathways for decarbonization. So the three, some of the big picture topics that I'm going to talk about today are decarbonization, what some different strategies for decarbonizing the grid are, and then things that are related to that. So just overall growth in electricity demand, how we charge customers for electricity, how distributed resources play a role that are not owned by utilities or government agencies. So hopefully we'll go through all of that. So I think to take from a big picture perspective, the electricity system, the electricity sector is very unique, right? If you think about all the sectors in the economy, how many sectors have been around for over 100 years that are, number one, still in existence, right? How many industries have grown and died? So how many have been around that long that are still in existence that are still poised for exponential growth, right? There's very few industries that have been around for that long that are poised for the transformation, and growth that the electricity system is going to experience in this country and the rest of the world over the coming decades. So I think it's a very exciting industry to be a part of because there's all of these challenges associated with it. How can we meet this load growth? How can we, and we'll talk about the sources of those load growth in a little bit, but they're changing almost faster than you can keep up with, right? Like it used to just be, oh, we have electric vehicles and we're going to electrify buildings. Now we have data center load growth, artificial intelligence, cryptocurrency, all of these things, all of it's adding up to enormous load growth. So how can we meet those increasing demands while decarbonizing, while keeping costs reasonable, while recovering those costs fairly, while doing all of that reliably? So there's a lot of challenges, but I think those challenges are what make this industry very exciting to be a part of and stimulating and fulfilling to be a part of. So some of the changes against that backdrop that are happening in the industry that we're going to talk about are the source of where our electricity comes from. So historically, it was very large-scale, centrally owned fossil fuel power plants, right? And now the source of the electricity supply is becoming more renewable, slanted towards wind and solar, and more distributed. So not just centrally scaled, very large plants, but potentially rooftop solar or other smaller community solar type of installations. And then the way that customers use the product as well. So this is in part what's driving all of the increase and forecasted increase in demands. But the things that we use electricity for are becoming more and more prevalent. So we used to, if the electricity went out 30 years ago, what would happen? Okay, maybe you can't turn the lights on or you can't watch TV. Now, if the electricity goes out, you can't do any of those things. Plus, if you work from home, you can't work. If your home's heated with electricity, you won't have a warm home. If you charge your car, you can't charge your car. So the impact of electricity is just becoming more and more prevalent in our lives, which puts even more emphasis on having a reliable grid and the impacts when we don't have a reliable grid. So lots are changing in the ways in which we use the product of electricity. And so we'll talk about all those things. But I do want to first just kind of take a backdrop of decarbonization and why this is critical for the electricity sector. And from a big picture perspective, not even focusing on electricity, we emit a lot of greenhouse gases. And scientists have said that if we want to keep climate change to a reasonable level, defined as something like warming of no greater than 2 degrees Celsius, there's going to have to be greenhouse gas reductions of approximately 80% below 1990 levels within the coming decades. That's rough math, but more or less the scale of decarbonization that needs to happen to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. So if you look at where all those greenhouse gases come from, about a quarter of those, at least in the US, come from the electric power sector. So you can see a pie graph there on the right. Electric power is now the second biggest sector behind transportation, so things like cars. Electric power actually used to be the largest, but there have been some recent emission reductions in electricity, and generally electricity, kind of a double-edged sword, but it is probably the easiest sector to decarbonize. So even though it's challenging, it's probably the easiest sector relative to something like buildings or cars or industry. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there are only a limited number of players in the electricity sector, so you can kind of just regulate and say, utility A, do this thing, and then they'll go do it. Whereas if you're trying to decarbonize industry, where there's 1,000 different companies, or decarbonize transportation, where there's millions of individual customers, you have to deal a lot more with consumer behavior and other things like that. So against that backdrop, we have tried to pass a lot of decarbonization policies at both the national and the state level. At a national level, it's been a little bit of a yo-yo effect, right? We had the Clean Power Plan until we didn't, because it got repealed. Then we have now the Inflation Reduction Act. We were in Paris until we were out of Paris. Now we're back in Paris. Honestly, it's hard to keep up with, but I think again, another double-edged sword of decarbonization policy is that within the electricity sector, most control of decisions around policy and utilities and what resources get built and all of the things that matter for decarbonization don't actually happen at the federal level, they happen at the state level. And so in California, we have different decarbonization targets that are written in law, 40% reductions by 2030, 80% reductions by 2050. New York has very similar goals. And even many cities that exist within red states also have decarbonization policies. So much of the United States does have very aggressive decarbonization policies, even if there is no unifying federal decarbonization target. And so that kind of means, like, even if, there's federal transitions one way, there's kind of this natural buffer of policy at the states. And it cuts both ways. So that is a lot of from a policy level, what's driving a lot of the individual actions at local levels. And beyond that, even if you have no policy in place, there are individual customers that can make their own decisions to decarbonize. And so if you look at a state like Texas that has very little policy, there's still tons of renewables in Texas. And a lot of that's driven by raw economics, but also customer choice as well. This is kind of what if we want to decarbonize, the magnitude of decarbonization needs to happen. Most of the greenhouse gases need to be reduced. If you look, again, before we zone in on electricity specifically, if you look across the entire economy, what are the different strategies to decarbonize? What I have listed here is something a type of study we produce a lot at E3 for various jurisdictions. And we've seen in doing different decarbonization studies across the country and the world, several common themes emerge. And these are themes that are common regardless of, are we looking at a jurisdiction with very cold weather or very hot weather, is kind of, whether or not it's a jurisdiction that has industrial base or something more service based. So these are kind of the common themes that we see present across any decarbonization study that we're doing. The first is that to decarbonize the economy energy use needs to be as efficient as possible. So using energy efficiency and conservation to minimize energy usage, whether that's energy efficient lighting or buildings, or just using less energy through conservation, like encouraging public transportation, making that more cost effective and more convenient. But you can't efficiency your way to zero. There's going to be some residual energy use. And so the question is how do you meet that residual energy use? The second strategy to meeting that residual energy use in a way that minimizes carbon is by using fuels that use less carbon. So for example, switching fuels from things like gasoline-powered cars to electric-powered cars, or transitioning buildings that are heated with natural gas to buildings that are heated with electricity. And we'll talk about that and how that's a huge source of electricity demand growth over the coming decades. But of course, switching to electricity only actually reduces carbon if the source of the electricity is low carbon, right? If you're producing electricity from coal and you're electrifying everything, you're not actually reducing any carbon. And so that's where the third pillar comes into play, decarbonizing electricity. There are several buckets of sources for decarbonizing electricity. First big bucket is renewables, so things like wind, water, solar. Another bucket is nuclear power. And a final bucket would be actually just continuing to use fossil infrastructure like natural gas, but instead of allowing the emissions to go up into the atmosphere, capturing them and then storing them underground. So that's carbon capture and sequestration. To a certain degree, depending on the jurisdiction that you're in, all of these options are on the table. What I'm going to be focusing on most today, because we're in California, is renewable energy, and primarily because renewable energy is the kind of inertia of where California is headed for a lot of reasons, economics, but also general policy. So going to be talking about renewables and the challenges of just decarbonizing with renewables, because it sounds great, but there are some challenges with just building a bunch of wind and solar and hoping that we can decarbonize reliably and economically. So that's the primary focus of what I'm going to be talking about today. And then the final bucket, which we won't be talking about as much, but I just wanted to include here, is that there are going to be some sectors of the economy that are very difficult to electrify. So for example, aviation is a great example where, the weight of batteries makes it very difficult to electrify a plane where weight is at a premium. And so there are certain sectors of the economy where fuels are going to continue to be needed, whether those are liquid fuels like jet fuel or gaseous fuels. And so finding ways to produce those fuels in a low carbon way is important, whether that's things like hydrogen, using renewable electricity to create hydrogen gas, which is oftentimes very substitutable for natural gas, or using biofuels or other sources to create renewable jet fuels. And so hopefully we can find ways to electrify everything possible, but to the extent that things are difficult or uneconomic to electrify, there might be a role for low carbon fuels as well. I promised we were going to focus on this third pillar here of decarbonizing electricity and specifically talking about some of the challenges of using renewable energy to decarbonize the electricity system. So why renewables? Well, the primary reason that there is a lot of support and inertia for renewables relative to other sources primarily comes down to cost. Renewables, as I said, when I was at Stanford, renewables solar cost $250 a megawatt hour. A couple of years ago, solar cost $25 a megawatt hour. Now with interest rates, it's gone up to $35 a megawatt hour. But still, it's like roughly an order of magnitude lower than it was. And the same is true for wind. And particularly in the United States, we have tons of land. Way more than, we are very lucky. You look at a lot of other countries like Japan or Taiwan or Europe, they're very much land constrained. In the United States, we have a lot of resource potential and we can build a lot of renewables at low cost. And at least historically, there was a lot of support, public support for renewable energy development. I think one of the unique things that's emerging now, which is something we need to grapple with, is there's becoming more and more pushback against renewable development. And there's basically pushback against development of everything, right? Nobody wants any new fossil, nobody wants any new renewables. It's very hard to build transmission. It's hard to build anything. And it's like, okay, well, what do you want? What are we supposed to do here? Short of just shutting down our economy. But so anyway, I put a question mark there because historically there has been a lot of public acceptance of renewables. There's increasing pushback against that. So that presents a separate set of challenges, but let's just, suspend for a minute and assume that we can actually build the renewables that we need to build. The question then is, how can we actually use those renewables to decarbonize the electricity system? Well, the primary challenge with renewables is that they produce energy when the sun is shining and when the wind is blowing. And that's not always lined up with exactly when we need them to be producing. And so the challenge of matching the supply with the demand when we need it is the renewable integration challenge. And there are a couple of different strategies for addressing this challenge that I will talk through. So before we kind of go into a renewable system, I think it helps to set a little bit of a level set for how the electricity system works. This is an example of just one day in the electricity system. What this has here is, this black line is electricity demand for each hour of the day. And you can see that it's changing throughout the day, right? When people wake up and they turn on the lights, electricity demand rises. Then maybe they go to work and shut off their homes, and then it gets hotter outside, they turn on their air conditioners, they cook dinner in the evening, electricity demand rises. You see that there are these patterns that repeat and emerge in electricity demands throughout the day and throughout the year. And from a grid operation perspective, a key principle that has to be met in order to keep everything working is that whatever electricity demand is, the electricity grid has to produce that amount of energy or generation to match demand exactly. If demand and generation do not match, then the grid will break, or there will be blackouts, or bad things will happen. So the utilities or grid operators have to match energy generation to demand in every hour of every day of every year. Historically, the way that they have done that is through generation that's dispatchable. So something like natural gas. Natural gas generators, you can ramp them up and down, you can turn them on and off. And so when electricity demand rises, you ramp natural gas generation up. When demand falls, you ramp it down. When it rises, you ramp it up, etc. And that was the way in which the grid was kept in balance. In balance just means that total generation equals total load at all times. So I don't want to say it's simple, but it's relatively simple, right? So then what happens when you start to add renewables to the system? Well, if we just take the system and add some wind and add some solar, what happens? Well, we can see that we get some energy in certain hours of the day from these resources, but overall, the things are still working. Why is it still working? Because we have this backdrop of a natural gas resource still, that's the gray here, that's still ramping up and down to keep the grid in balance. So when solar here is producing a lot in the middle of the day, we're not getting very much, we've ramped down natural gas generation a lot. And then as solar sets, we ramp up natural gas generation a lot. So natural gas really still in this system here is the balancing resource that's keeping the grid in balance. But you can also see what we've done by adding renewables to this system is the total area of gray has gone down, right? And the total area is really the generation from natural gas, which is what leads to emissions. So if we're trying to decarbonize, we're trying to reduce the area of natural gas. So we've gone from a lot of natural gas to less natural gas. So you say, okay, this is a great decarbonization strategy. Let's just keep building more wind and solar. So what happens if you do that? Well, if you just keep building wind and solar, you can see these mismatches start to become more and more pronounced. And if we just build a lot of solar, for example, what happens is that we now have hours in the middle of the day where total generation is exceeding load. And so in order to keep the grid in balance, that solar actually has to be curtailed or essentially wasted or disconnected from the grid. And so that sort of curtailed energy is represented here as red. And so that's, not sent to the grid. So only what's being shown here is being sent to the grid to keep the system in balance. But then simultaneously in the evening after the sun sets, there's not enough renewables to meet load, so natural gas generators have to ramp up. So the challenge here is that if we just keep building more and more renewables and do nothing else, there's going to be mismatches between when those renewables are producing and when we're consuming electricity in a way that is not going to allow the system to fully decarbonize and will simultaneously result in wasted renewable energy. So what are the solutions to this? And this again is the integration challenge. So what are the solutions to sort of fixing this issue and allowing renewables to decarbonize the grid? Well, the first most obvious solution that probably everyone's thinking of right now is let's build energy storage. And that's a very elegant, simple solution, right? If you just build some batteries, you can say, okay, I'm going to build batteries. And then in the middle of the day when solar is producing more than the grid needs, I'm going to charge those batteries. And then in the evening, instead of dispatching natural gas, I'm going to dispatch batteries because batteries are something that, like natural gas, can be turned on and off. And so what does that look like? That just looks like I'm going to build some batteries. And so this batteries here are represented as purple. And so you can say maybe instead of curtailing solar energy in the middle of the day, I'm going to actually absorb that energy to charge the batteries and then dispatch those batteries in the morning and the evening. And so in here, all the purple is battery storage discharge. And what you can see is that at least on this particular day, if we build enough batteries, then the system is now 100% decarbonized. So seems like an easy answer, right? But what's the challenge with this? There's lots of challenges, but one is the fact that batteries they cost money, right? They're definitely a lot cheaper than they used to be, but they still cost money. So even though this is a technically feasible solution, it doesn't mean it's the most economic solution. So what would be another alternative to helping match up demand and supply that avoids building this amount of batteries? Well, one solution would be to just change the way in which we consume energy or electricity. So if we could consume electricity in a way that increases consumption in the middle of the day when there's a lot of solar on the grid and decreases consumption in the evening when we would be dispatching natural gas plants, that could potentially be a way to reduce emissions that avoids having to build batteries. And we would want to do that if in fact it's cheaper to modulate the way in which we consume energy than it is to make investments in resources like battery storage. So this is just a kind of what this looks like. Okay, we've increased our usage in the middle of the day, we've decreased our usage in the evening. And you might say, well, how is that happening? Like what's actually doing that? Well, there are lots of different strategies of what are called flexible loads. Some loads are not flexible, right? A flexible load means you can shift when you're consuming electricity. Many loads cannot be shifted. Like right now, we're in this room, these lights are on, this computer's on, this is using electricity. This is not a shiftable load. We need this electricity right here, right now. But many loads can be flexible. So if you think about cooling your home, typically the way that works today is people go to work, they're not in their house because they're not home. Of course, they're not going to run the air conditioner. Why would you be cooling an empty house? So throughout the day, the home is heating up. Then they get home and they turn their air conditioner on. And the house has to come back down to a very cool level right in the evening. Well, maybe it would actually be better for the home to pre-cool itself while the person's not there, get down to a very cool level, and then when the person actually gets home, the home's already cool and doesn't need to use as much electricity in the evening. So it's a strategy for shifting the time of day in which the home is cooling itself in a way that is more aligned with when the grid actually has low cost, low carbon energy available. That's just one example. Another example is car charging. So instead of, a typical, maybe a base case scenario would be you buy an electric vehicle and you drive around all day and then you come home at 5, 6 p.m. and plug your car into your garage. Well, maybe a better solution would be if you drive your car to work, charge your car at work all day, and then come home, don't charge it, then go back to work the next day and charge it. So you're always kind of doing the base load charging at work in the middle of the day when the sun is out. So that's just another strategy that California is looking at. There's all sorts of strategies for loads that can be shifted. Again, not everything can be shifted, but many things can be shifted, whether it's when we heat and cool buildings, when we charge cars, when we use appliances. So, and the smarter those appliances are, the easier it becomes to shift them around, right? We don't want to have us as consumers tinkering with these things and, monitoring the thing. If you can just say appliance, like run at the best time for the grid and for my electricity bill, and it will just do it. So that is for flexible, that is some examples of flexible loads. And so again, flexible loads are just shifting how we use electricity in a way that better lines up with when renewables are producing. So those are two strategies. I promised you 4. So what's the third strategy? The third strategy is a bit unintuitive. And what the third strategy is actually kind of what I said not to do at the beginning. But what if we just keep building renewables? What if we just take this and just keep building more? And on the one hand, this seems like a bad solution because we get more and more curtailment, right? That red sort of wasted energy. But on the other hand, it really is an economic question. If in fact it's cheaper to keep building renewables than it is to do other integration strategies like battery storage or flexible load, then this could be an economic part of the integration solution. And I put this here not to say that this is the answer or that we should do this instead of building battery storage or instead of using flexible loads. The reality is that a least cost electricity system is going to do all of these things to a certain degree. And the point is that if you look at a cost minimal system, that has a lot of renewables and is deeply decarbonized, there is going to be some curtailment. Like, we don't need to worry about eliminating all of the red excess generation on the system. Sometimes there's going to be that during certain times of year or certain times of day. That is part of a least cost solution. So I think that's also something that is not initially intuitive when people think about decarbonizing the electricity system, sort of accepting that they're part of a least cost solution is going to involve certain hours of the day or of the year where we're curtailing renewables, and that's okay. And increasingly, if we can get more and more flexible loads that can figure out things to do with this potentially free energy, then that's going to be something that emerges as well, right? There's a lot of new loads that are extremely flexible, like hydrogen or cryptocurrency, etc. And to the extent that those loads can figure out something to do with that energy, then that's fantastic as well. So that's the third solution. And then the fourth solution is also kind of a bit unintuitive, but it's what if we change the geographic scope of the grid? And that is something called regional integration. So right now, at least in the Western US, we have a very fragmented grid. We have about 38 different balancing authorities that are covering the western half of the United States that are all operating relatively independently. And there's increasing movements to better integrate those that are actively underway right now, but at least historically, they've operated very independently. The benefits of more tightly integrating all of those together are that there is a lot of regional diversity in how renewables produce energy. So for example, it's generally not cloudy everywhere. If it's cloudy in one place, it might be sunnier in another place. If it's less windy in one place, it might be windy in another place. And so the broader of a geographic area that you can aggregate renewables over, the smoother those renewable production profiles become. And so you can see here, this is illustrative, but the point still stands. We have a lot of, here we have a tip, this is like one place on the electricity grid. We have sun that's rising and setting with the sun at that place on the electricity grid. We have wind that is relatively volatile, right? We have a lot of production in the morning. It ramps down in the middle of the day, ramps up production in the evening. But if we were to aggregate over a much wider geographic area, those profiles become smoother, right? Particularly for solar, you now have multiple time zones where the sun is kind of overhead for longer because it's rising earlier in the morning, setting later in the evening when you look at multiple time zones. And wind, there's just more ability to balance out low production areas with high production areas. So the net result of this, right, if we take this kind of less regionally integrated area with a more regionally integrated area, you can see that the gray is shrinking, right? Again, the gray is the total production of natural gas. Minimizing that is what minimizes emissions. So if we can integrate renewables and smooth out their production profiles, we can minimize the quantity of natural gas generation. I have here just kind of some examples of what more regional integration and coordination might look like in the electricity system. This map right here is what I was alluding to for the Western United States. So this is just a map of the Western United States. This is our very balkanized system that we have with 38 different balancing authorities. Again, there is a movement as we speak to more closely coordinate those, but that's still underway. Another eccentricity of the grid in the United States is that it's actually 3 different grids. We have a Western grid, an Eastern grid, and Texas. I think probably you covered that. And so those are electrically separate, but if we could somehow interconnect those grids more closely, there could be a lot of benefits to shipping renewables all over the United States, taking advantage of the really great wind resource that exists in the middle of the country, the really great solar resource that exists in the Southwest, and to a lesser extent, but still very good in the Southeast, and then Texas, which just, I guess, God loved and gave wind and solar. And, even if you look in the West, there's a lot of, even if you say, okay, we're never going to connect the West with the East, but if we just look at the West, we have a lot of solar down here, we have a lot of wind up here, and then the Pacific Northwest is probably the hydro capital of the world. So if you could find ways to allow those to all work together, that's going to decrease the need to do everything else, right? Decrease the need to overbuild, decrease the need for energy storage, decrease the need to do flexible loads. But a lot of the challenges of regional integration are not a technical challenge, they're a policy challenge. So even in the West, right, you have states that don't want to be associated with each other. California does not want to be associated with coal-burning Montana, and coal-burning Montana does not want to be associated with hippie liberal California. And so getting a acceptable governance structure for a West-wide grid is challenging. And the final thing that I want to talk about from an integration perspective, if we just back up to this slide again, we've gone over the general challenges and strategies, but another important thing is that this is just one day, right? We've been focusing on one day, and that's good for getting the concepts down, but every day is vastly different, right? You have days where it's really hot, and so people are using a ton of air conditioning and loads are very high. You have days where it's cloudy, solar is less, it's not windy, the wind is blowing less. So all of these things are moving around all the time. And from a reliability perspective, which is keeping the lights on, that's an all the time problem, right? You can't be like, oh, well, it's cloudy today, so electricity, we're cutting it off. So from a reliability perspective, it becomes very necessary to look at all of the potential conditions that could happen on the grid. And that is where the last integration, and probably my personal thing that I focus on the most and think is coolest, but is the need for firm generation, particularly clean firm generation. So what this is kind of a complicated chart, but it's actually hopefully pretty simple if we just walk through it. This is a simulation from a study that we did in New England, looking at a deeply decarbonized electricity grid in the year 2050. What this is showing here on the bottom is for this system that we were evaluating, we have 52 bars here, 1 bar for each week of the year. And what this is showing is in each week of the year, where is energy generation coming from? So the colors here are, we have tan, which is zero carbon, but it's primarily nuclear and hydro. So those are zero carbon dispatchable generation. We can control their output, at least control them more than, for example, wind and solar. So we have this system has a lot of hydro and a lot of nuclear. It also has a lot of wind. That's the blue. You can see a pattern of the wind, right? It tends to blow more in the winter than in the summer. So the blue bars are taller in the winter than in the summer. And then the yellow solar, it actually has the opposite impact, right? As we all know, it's sunnier in the summer. So solar output is larger in the summer than in the winter. And then the other bars here, the gray is natural gas or some type of dispatchable generation. And then the red, as we looked at before, is curtailment. And every week of the year looks a little bit different, right? If we just hone in on 1 week at the end of the year and we zoom in on an hourly perspective, so that's what this top graph is showing. It's zooming in on this particular week. We have 7 days of electricity demand and supply and how those line up against each other. And what you can see is that for this entire week, 7 straight days, the grid is 100% zero carbon energy. There's enough renewables and nuclear and hydro combined with a little bit of battery storage to help balance everything out, where we can meet all of the demands of the grid from zero carbon energy while keeping the grid in balance. In every hour of the day, we can exactly generate what the grid is consuming. And so in this particular week, the grid is 100% zero energy, but not every week looks like that, right? Let's look at a particularly challenging week. So if we jump to the beginning of the year, we can see that there's a week where electricity demand is very high, probably because it's very cold outside, and this system that we were simulating had a lot of building electrification, so a lot of the buildings had transitioned to electric heating, so when it gets cold, demand goes up. So demand is high, and renewables are having a bad week, right? Wind is just generally low, and solar in particular, if we look on day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, solar is almost non-existent. So this is saying that across a very broad regional area of New England, there's just some type of big storm system that has come through and has depressed solar output. So the system here does not have enough energy from renewables to meet load in much of this entire week. So renewables aren't keeping the lights on. What about energy storage? Well, energy storage is also going to not help this system at all. Energy storage requires periods of excess energy to charge from. This here, for the first 4 days, there's no excess energy to charge the storage. So just adding batteries to this system won't really help. What this system needs is a resource that can be turned on and left on for as long as needed. And the category of resource that that's referring to is something that system planners call firm resources. So today, the firm resources on the system are primarily natural gas, to a lesser extent coal that's being phased out, but still natural gas. And then in a zero carbon system, those resources can be replaced by something else like that is also zero carbon but also firm. So something like hydrogen or geothermal or ultra long duration energy storage, right? If you had a battery that didn't need to be charged every day because it was going to run out of charge, if you could have a battery that could discharge for an entire week, then maybe that battery could get you through this really challenging stretch. But certainly the batteries that exist today don't have the duration to be able to discharge for that long. So that is again part of a least cost 100% zero carbon system, is to have a significant quantity of clean firm generation. And I will say, sometimes people say, well, what if I just want to do only renewables and battery storage? Is that possible? And the answer is, yeah, that's possible, right? You could take this system and just build more wind and solar and battery storage. You would have to be building wind and solar and storage for the worst week, which is this week right here. But even on the absolute worst day, we're still getting some solar and we're getting some wind. So if we just built a lot more, we could theoretically build enough wind and solar to be able to make this week 100% zero carbon. The problem is, what would that look like? Well, what that would look like is if we build wind and solar for the worst week, on all of the other weeks where we already had enough wind and solar, now we have way more than we need. And that leads to all of the extra red here, which is curtailment. So is this an economic solution? Probably not, right? Not only is it wasteful to build more wind and solar, but it also takes a lot of materials, takes a lot of land. So beyond economics, there's also environmental implications of more materials and more land. This is actually, the New England study that I've been referring to. This is kind of what that looks like. If you plug everything that I just talked about into an optimization model, and you say, okay, I know I need to meet electricity demands in every hour of the year. These are the resources that I have at my disposal, and take into account all of their variable production profiles. And I want to do it in a least cost way. What's the optimal mix of resources? This is what an optimization model will output. And this is another common type of analysis that's done in the electricity sector. And, just to cover a few key points from this, one takeaway is that a least cost system has a diversity of resources. There is not one least cost resource. You will often read articles in the news that say like, oh, this resource is now cheaper than this resource. And it's like, that's not the way it really works. Resources are cheapest when they work together because resources have different characteristics. Like comparing the cost of natural gas to solar is something the press loves to do, or coal to gas, or coal to solar, or coal to wind, whatever it is, right? But they have such different characteristics that it becomes a meaningless comparison. And in fact, a least cost system has a diversity of resources. There's storage, there's wind, there's onshore wind and offshore wind, there's distributed solar, there's utility scale solar. And this resource at the bottom of dispatchable, which is natural gas. And the two charts here are showing installed capacity and the energy that those resources are producing, right? Just because you have a resource installed doesn't mean you generate energy from it. And what this is showing is that we need a large base of dispatchable that's actually growing over time for reliability. But because we're building renewables, we can actually use that less. And using a resource like natural gas is what actually creates emissions. So we should be focused on reducing the usage of it, not reducing the installed capacity of it. Because when you need it, you need it. When the wind and solar stop blowing, then you're going to be glad you have it. That is an overview of thinking about decarbonizing the electricity supply. I'm going to jump now to the other side of the equation, which is on electricity demand, particularly electrification. We talked about, from an economy-wide perspective, decarbonizing the economy is likely going to require significant fuel switching, transitioning gasoline and diesel-powered cars and trucks to electrically powered cars and trucks, transitioning buildings that are heated with natural gas or that use oil for heating or that use natural gas for water heating. All of those things can be readily electrified, right? There's electric vehicles for transportation, and then the workhorse of the building sector is electric heat pumps. So it's a very efficient way to use electricity to heat buildings. So those are the primary, and then this other one is my mom's least favorite, but is transitioning natural gas stoves to electric stoves. It's such a small, if you think about the total amount of gas that any building uses, right? The cooking is a very small percentage of it relative to heating and water heating, but it's the most controversial, right? There's actually huge restaurant unions and organizations that are protesting getting rid of gas stoves in Los Angeles and other cities around the country. And so I think it's one of the big challenges that, from a politics perspective, is because it's something that people interact with viscerally every day, right? Like there's tangible differences between cooking with a gas stove and an electric stove. Whereas, if your building's the right temperature, like you don't really care. Some people don't even know how their building's heated, right? Electric, gas doesn't matter. So as long as the energy service is there, but stoves are going to be a challenge. So if you add all of those new demands up that are going to be created from electrification that is necessary for decarbonization, what does that do to total demand? Well, it does something like double total demand. So you can see here, this graph on the left is showing change in electricity demand between roughly now and 2050. And these gray bars on bottom are kind of existing electricity demands. And then again, this is all from the same New England case study that we've been talking through. And then these colored sections here are talking about the sectors that are experiencing growing demand. So primarily, the electrification load growth is coming from buildings, transportation, and industry. New England is not a huge industrial base generally, so that's why there's just not as much industry to electrify in New England. If you were to look at other states, like for example, Texas or China or something like that, potentially a lot more potential for industrial electricity demand growth. But in New England, it's primarily transportation and buildings, something like a 92% increase, so close to doubling of electricity demand. That's a lot. particularly in a place that doesn't have a lot of land, particularly in a place that is very averse to new development, which is very similar to everywhere else, right? It's like, yes, we have this growing demand, but we don't want to build anything else. So at some point, something has to give. The other thing I'll say about increasing demand and load growth is that it's not just the total quantity of load that's growing, it's also the nature of how it's growing. So right now in the United States and most grids in the world and in the US, the peak electricity demand, which again, from a reliability perspective is a demand that has to be met, right? We have to have enough generation to meet the peak. That occurs in the summer when it's really hot outside and everyone has their air conditioners on. And so that's kind of the planning criteria that most grids are built around, is around meeting that summer peak demand. Increasingly, as buildings electrify, more and more demand growth is going to come in the winter, right? When you are now using electricity for heating, all of a sudden you're growing electricity demands much more in the winter than in the summer, and systems are going to start to become winter peaking. And so that's something that is going to likely, this is a scenario, right? If New England decarbonizes in a way, as we've kind of projected in this study, the system will become winter peaking. And this is a trend that holds not only in New England, but in many other parts of the country, the Pacific Northwest, even California. So that is an additional challenge in thinking about how can you match supply with demand in every hour of the year, thinking about these new winter peaking loads. There are, a couple of, I add this slide mainly more from a policy perspective in thinking about what is the right way to decarbonize the electricity system. There's kind of two schools of thought. One is a sort of command and control perspective, and another is a free market perspective. A free market perspective would just say, we're going to decarbonize by adding a carbon tax and letting the market figure out the least cost decarbonization solution. A command and control approach would say, we are deciding from a policy perspective that the path we're going down is electric vehicles, or the path we're going down is heat pumps. From an economics perspective, economists might say it's actually most cost effective and most efficient to just let the market decide. But there are certain cases where that might not actually be feasible or desirable. And the cases where that is true is when really large infrastructure investments are needed. So for example, if we think about decarbonizing vehicles that today run on gasoline and diesel, there's kind of two paths you could go down. One, you could say, we're going to go down an electric vehicle path. The other would say, we're going to go down a hydrogen vehicle path. You probably don't want to build out the infrastructure for both of those and then see which is cheaper, right? You don't want to build a bunch of charging stations and a huge hydrogen pipeline network, and then let the market compete. You kind of need it makes just somebody needs to say, okay, this is the path we're going down. We're doing electric vehicles. We're going to invest in charging stations, and we'll never know what the world would have looked like with hydrogen. And we need to do studies to try to make the best guess of what the most economic and feasible solution is, but we don't really want to have competition from that perspective. The same is true for buildings, right? And this is, I think, hydrogen vehicles, I don't know anyone who's strongly advocating those, but buildings are much more of a wild card. There is a big movement to electrify buildings in many places of the country, including California. There's also big lobbying from the gas industry to decarbonize buildings with zero carbon gaseous fuels, particularly gas utilities that want to continue their business. And so in Southern California, that's where there's the electric utility, SoCal Edison, and the gas utility, SoCal Gas. Those two are at odds with each other. One sees an decarbonization future of electrifying buildings, another sees a decarbonization future of low carbon gas delivery. So that's a policy decision that ultimately is gonna have to get made, because again, we probably don't want to do both. Okay, the other piece of demand, so we're still on the demand side here, is thinking about, I mentioned one of the challenges with any time you start to try to get a lot of people to do something is thinking about consumer behavior and how you can actually incentivize them to do that. We talked about flexible loads, right? Getting people to consume energy in the middle of the day instead of in the evening. That's a great idea, and there's many technical options for that, right? Like smart thermostats or charging your car at different times. But the question then becomes, how do you actually get people to do that? The way you get people to do that is by giving them an economic incentive to do that, or charging them for electricity in a way that incentivizes them to do that. If you just charge people based on how much electricity they consume, which is historically how we've charged people for electricity in this country, and again, it's a very simple way to do it, right? Everyone understands you use more electricity, your electricity bill goes up. If that's the way in which you charge people for electricity, there's zero incentive to do flexible loads. And in fact, there could be a negative incentive to do it. Because if you pre-cool your building when you're at work, you're probably actually going to use slightly more energy than if you waited until the evening, because you're kind of cooling it over a longer period where more energy will leak outside. And so you have to have a strategy of charging customers in a way that incentivizes them to do the behaviors that you want them to do. So this is a complicated slide that I will try to walk through, but this is essentially just outlining 4 different ways in which utilities can charge customers for electricity and what the implications of each of those options are. The first, simplest way in which utilities can charge for energy is just, as I just said, based on how much energy you consume. And so that's why this graph right here is showing a straight line. As your usage goes up, your utility bill goes up. And historically, this is, again, the most common way in which we've charged for electricity. It's a very simple, very easy to understand, but it's very hard to incentivize optimal behavior increasingly when we need that behavior as part of a least cost decarbonization strategy. I say that most states have had this up here on the left. What California has actually had is a very different system for charging for electricity. It's what's illustrated in the top right. And it's what's called, we don't have this anymore, historically California had this, it's what's called a tiered electricity system. And what that means is that actually the more you use, the more the price goes up. So for your first tranche of electricity, it's actually a pretty cheap price. Once you get into the second tranche, the price goes up, your bill goes up even more, etc., etc. Why did California have this? The reason is because, one, it was a very effective signal to reduce electricity usage, because most people ended up in the second or the third tier where the price was very high. And so a small improvement in energy efficiency could lead to very large bill reductions. So there's this very strong incentive to be more efficient. And to the extent that rooftop solar was a way to reduce bills, it very strongly incentivized rooftop solar as well. So that's the one side of it. The other side of it is that it was a relatively progressive way to charge for electricity, because generally wealthier customers owned or have larger homes that consume more electricity. So the system is able to put more of the system costs onto those customers than the smaller customers. So you might be thinking, okay, those all seem like pretty good things. Progressive, incentivizes energy efficiency. Why did California move away from that system? Well, the problem is because for the first time in California's history, we no longer want to just incentivize people to use less electricity. We want to incentivize people to use more electricity. We want to incentivize people to buy electric vehicles. We want to incentivize people to replace their natural gas heaters with electric heat pumps. Those are all going to increase electricity usage and therefore increase utility bills. And so if customers we're seeing exponential bill increases by buying an electric vehicle, then people just weren't going to do that. And so California has shifted to a new structure that is a time of use structure. First of all, it's gotten rid of the tiers. And second of all, it's added a time of use component. That's what this third bullet or this third graph is showing here. So this is a system where there's no tiers, so we don't have this like exponentially increasing slope. It's just a system where, there's no tiers, so we kind of don't penalize increased electricity use beyond just standard increased use. And if you can actually have that increased use come in off-peak periods, which are in California, the middle of the day when solar energy is abundant, there's a lower price that's charged in that time, then you incentivize people to use electricity in that time of the day and decrease their usage in other on-peak times of day, which are primarily in the evening when natural gas generators are running. So that is what California has now. There's also, and this is something that's being actively debated at the California Public Utilities Commission, a potential option to change the way we charge for electricity even further, where we take some of the cost that the utility needs to recover and recover that through a fixed monthly charge. This says every customer, regardless of how much they use, is going to pay some fee just to be connected to the grid. And then we're going to charge people for electricity above and beyond that. The benefits of that type of a structure are that if the utility can recover some of its costs from just fixed payments, then it doesn't have to charge as high of a price for usage. So the slope here, right, and this one is just the slope here is just lower. So the cost per kilowatt hour of electricity has gone down, and that creates even more of an incentive for people to increase usage through electric vehicles and building electrification, because you buy an electric vehicle, your bill is not going to go up very much. And one of the things that California is also looking at in deciding what these fixed charges are is by looking at income. This is something that probably at this point is not going to happen. It keeps changing, but it's California's attempt to say, we used to have a progressive rate structure where we put more costs on higher income people. So we're going to try to do something similar with fixed charges, but turns out that it might not actually be feasible or legal. And so that's being debated, I think, as we speak at the legislature and utility commission. So TBD exactly what happens on that front. Okay, so a couple more things I wanted to cover on the demand side were around distributed energy resources. Distributed energy resources, what are often called DERs, are another way in which customers can sort of participate in helping to meet their own electricity demands. It's a very loose category of things that are kind of related but kind of not related. So distributed energy resources could be technically anything from things like energy efficiency to electric vehicles, but most often refers to things like smart thermostats or rooftop solar or batteries in the garage, like a Tesla Powerwall. And these are options that are available to customers today that have not historically been available. There have been a lot of technological advancements that have enabled these. There have been a lot of price declines in these technologies, particularly things like solar and storage, that have made it more economic for customers to do this. And oftentimes customers just want to do these things. They want to take some control over their own energy usage in a way that's not just buying power from a utility that they might not like. And in California, that's more true than in many other places. But the question really for distributed energy resources is, how can these resources integrate into the system in a way that's fair for everybody? And a lot of where the challenges come from this are around things that seem really great initially, but might have some unintended consequences in the background. And I think a prime example of this is around a policy that we've historically had in California to incentivize rooftop solar called net energy metering. What net energy metering, the way it works historically, and this is a policy that's not just in California, it's in many states, is that it allows customers to sell power back to the grid at the same price as the utility was charging them for power. And for a customer that has solar, this is going to happen a lot, right? Because you put solar on your house in the same way as we were looking at a grid that had a lot of solar that was over generating in the middle of the day. Chances are, if you put solar on your house in the middle of the day when you're at work, your solar panels are going to be generating more energy than your house is actually consuming. Like maybe your fridge is on and a couple small other things, but generally not consuming electricity. So those customers are sending power back to the grid, and they are able to sell that power to the utility for the same price that the utility was charging them for power. And if you think about this framework, right, you could just imagine, well, if you size your solar such that it's producing on average the same amount of power as you're consuming, what is your utility bill? It's zero, right? Even though your solar might not be producing at the same time as you're consuming, if it's producing the same quantity of energy and you're able to sell it back and cancel out your purchases in the evening, your total utility bill is zero. Well, what's the problem with this? Problem with this is that there's still the electricity grid, the fixed cost of the poles and the wires that are enabling that entire situation to happen. You are still relying on the electricity grid at night to draw power from. And in fact, you're also relying on the electricity grid in the middle of the day to have a vehicle to sell power. And for a utility that's regulated, which all utilities in this entire country are regulated, that's the role of the California Public Utility Commission. Every state has their own commission. Utilities are allowed to recover their costs. And so if a bunch of customers with rooftop solar are no longer paying for the fixed cost of the electricity grid, that cost is still going to get paid for, but it's going to get paid for by raising the rates for everybody else who doesn't have solar. And that dynamic is referred to as a cost shift. And it's particularly challenging in many places like California, because oftentimes the people who have rooftop solar are customers who own their own homes, who are wealthier, and the customers who are picking up the tab for that are customers who don't have, who are less wealthy and who don't own their homes and who don't have an opportunity to do rooftop solar. So California has worked to kind of mitigate this situation. There's a policy that was actually just implemented last year called Net Energy Metering 3.0 or NEM 3.0. And that is a policy that essentially does not allow customers to sell energy back to the grid at the retail price, but only at how much that is actually reducing the utility's cost. So utility getting energy does provide value, right? It means they don't have to generate it themselves, but it doesn't allow customers to kind of sell back at the retail price, because the retail price includes the cost of the grid, and those customers aren't actually producing grid, they're just producing energy. So does NEM 3.0 solve the issue? No, it doesn't, because there's still the issue of customers offsetting their own usage and the contributions they would be making to the grid from their own usage. So it solves about half the problem, but is nonetheless a step in the right direction. And the final thing I'll say is about the utility business model. So, I think there was this fear maybe 10 plus years ago when rooftop solar was growing gangbusters, and people were worried that customers were just like with cable, right? Customers start cutting the cord with the utility. Everyone's gonna have their own solar, maybe batteries in the garage. They're gonna cut the cord and everyone's gonna be self-sufficient. But is that actually a realistic future of the grid? I would posit no. And the reason for that is for the same reason, if we go all the way back to the regional integration point that we made, it's more economic when we're more connected. When we can balance out, oh, it's sunny in this area and cloudy in this area, let's ship some power over here. windy, not windy. Let's help balance things out. That becomes even more true on an individual customer basis, right? You know, when you are your own house, right? If you have house guests come into town for the week, your electricity usage is going to go up, right? If you have a baby, if you get a new TV, if your kids go to college, usage is constantly bouncing up and down. You don't want to have to be like, oh, I have house guests, better rent some more solar panels this week to make sure I have enough electricity. You want to have everything be balancing out. And that is the role that the utility plays. The utility is the connector that creates a system that is overall least cost. So I would posit that there's an increasing role for the utility and the investments of the utility to help interconnect everything and truly create a least cost system. And you know, that doesn't mean that it's people can't put rooftop solar, but it does mean that, you know, it's not going to be economic to cut the cord. You're still going to need the utility to help balance things out, and those customers should still be paying their fair share towards grid costs as everybody else. Thanks.